Good morning. Oh, it's morning here still. I'm in Central Time Zone, so good afternoon to many of you. Welcome to continuing the conversations. I'm Stephanie Cooper. I am the Strategic Communications and Clergy Engagement Manager at the Alliance, and I'm so glad that y'all are here today. And I'm so glad that Brian Harrington has agreed to lead this session. Um, it is titled An Ongoing Obstacle to Partnership, Hidden Racism in the White Church. I'm going to introduce Brian and then just hand it over to him. I'm so glad that he is here. I have a small child behind me, so you'll have to forgive me. Our childcare did not work out today. Um, Brian Harrington, who previously served for 13 years as a solo pastor and co-pastor, now assists ministers, lay people, and congregations in uncovering obstacles to creating justice and discovering opportunities for liberation. We are so glad to have Brian with us this morning. Brian, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to you and the Alliance for offering this opportunity today and for being so generous to all of us and giving these opportunities over the last month and in the month to come. And thank you to all of you who are here today. I appreciate you taking some time in the middle of your day to be here to talk about something really fun like racism. So I'm very thankful for you being here to be a part of this today. So let me share my screen with you all, um, and um, and we will get started. So as we get going today, um, uh, I want to start out by saying what I'm talking about today is something that I care a lot about, and you will hear some of the ways that that has evidenced itself as I talk today. But I am reminded of the saying that the more you learn, the less you know. And so I am not coming to you as the expert, and definitely not as the definitive expert. But I hope that I can be a conversation starter and conversation partner today as we think through these things that are really important to us. So let me give you a quick overview as we look at a nice picture of Saint James Baldwin. Um, I have sainted him. I don't know that anybody else has, so forgive me for doing that. But first of all, we're going to start talking about white Christians and racism, and ask the question, is white Christian racism only a problem for conservatives? Because I think all of us who spend much time thinking about this can easily believe that it's just a problem for folks over there. Um, but it seems that maybe we do have this problem. So why do we have it? And there are a couple of reasons that I suggest for why this remains a problem for us, and I'll offer some ideas, some tentative ideas of things that we can do to address this issue that again is really important to all of us. So let's get started. Several years ago, when my spouse Ashley and I were co-pastors of a church nominally affiliated with the Alliance, we faced the same challenge that many of you encountered during the twin pandemics of 2020, facing simultaneously COVID-19 and the so-called racial reckoning that followed, particularly the murder of George Floyd by a supposed, quote, law enforcement officer. In striving to keep our congregation safe from the coronavirus, we worshiped virtually for a year, uh, and not in person, virtually for a year, and in striving to be faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ as we best understood it, we preached passionately to the tiny green dot that I see here on my computer screen right now. When we were preaching virtually, I got really bold preaching to this tiny little dot on my computer screen as I recorded my sermon every other week. But we called on our congregants and ourselves to recognize our culpability and participation in our deeply racialized society with hope that we could together repent for harm that we had done and repair harm that we had done in order to participate in the sacred work of co-laboring with God to bring about what Bill Leonard terms God's new day, God's peaceable reign on earth as it is in heaven. There was a problem, though, with preaching about the centrality of anti-racism to the gospel, especially in the context of a church in a relatively small southern town, and particularly during a deeply contentious presidential election year. So we heard about how parishioners wanted to come to church merely to be comforted rather than confronted by hard truths. I was told that our sermons were too political and that after the election ended, I would be preaching sweet sermons about the woman at the well. Because, of course, there's nothing political about a woman who's at the well in the middle of the day because she's so outcast that she doesn't go when everybody else is there. But there was a deeper problem, which I did not see. There was a lack of awareness among my white congregants for how they participate in and perpetuate harm to people of color. One congregant's comment to my spouse succinctly states the problem. "We don't have any racist or white supremacist in our church," she said, "so I don't understand why you're preaching about racism all the time." No racists or white supremacists in the church. What a harmful delusion. But as much as I have derided those comments since then, I realized during research that I did for my Doctor of Ministry project at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary that in my naivete about progressive churches, I had unintentionally come to a similar conclusion, though about a different subset of white Christians. Before I started interviewing leaders of predominantly white Protestant Christian churches, I wanted to believe that if only I could be in a progressive enough church in or near a large city or in a college town, that somehow just being in the right kind of church would make doing the work of anti-racism magically easy. I wanted to believe, in a matter of speaking, that surely there are no racist or white supremacists in real, unlike my sort of fake, alliance churches. To be clear, I know unquestionably that the racist ideology of white superiority lives within me, and I'm relatively certain that all of us have racist ideology within us because racism is, to use the imagery of the Racial Justice Institute in Greensboro, North Carolina, is in the groundwater from which we all drink. Just by living in a racialized society, we are all infected with the disease. So truly, my naive hope was that progressive churches, both as institutions and as the constitutive individual members, would clearly articulate how they have been infected by racism and reproduce inequity individually, culturally, and systemically, and would be committed without qualification or exception to work toward a world where everyone thrives, fulfilling Jesus's promise of abundant life here and now. And sadly, that too was a delusion. In my very small research sample size, 3 churches that were affiliated with the Alliance, including 3 churches that were affiliated with the Alliance of Baptists, if you include the church that I co-pastored. It was not merely my rural congregation that offered resistance to striving toward racial justice. Even the other, quote, bona fide Alliance churches, where I interviewed pastors and lay members, some of whom are on this call right now, and I'm so glad to see them. But through my interviews with them, my naivete was shattered by the ways congregants did things to block the cleansing of the temple, as it were, of racist attitudes and structures. Sometimes it was subtle, like the feeling that one congregant had that, excuse me, that the diversity in her church was not well reflected in the diversity within worship, and using the diversity of cultures represented in the church as inspiration to the way that the congregation worshiped together, or hidden, like parishioners whispering to each other that their pastor focused on anti-racism to the exclusion of other important issues. But other times it was overt, like church lay leadership publicly and repeatedly blocking efforts of anti-racism in the church, ostensibly because they were not dignified enough and seemed too strident, a criticism rooted in white supremacist culture. And even if you doubt the applicability of my small sample size to the broader alliance, Michael O. Emerson and Glenn E. Bracey II, who published a book only a few weeks ago, The Religion of Whiteness, have shown that not only are 2/3 of all white practicing Christians stricter adherents of what they have termed the religion of whiteness, something that's exemplified by a belief in the superiority of white people, but even among the more progressive mainline Protestant denominations, they say from their 5 years of research, including surveys, focus groups, and interviews of people representing regional diversity in the whole country, they say that even of progressive mainline Protestant denominations, 1 in 6 people are adherents of the religion of whiteness, exhibiting higher allegiance to whiteness than to Jesus. Their work only serves to confirm the previous extensive research by fellow Baptist Robert P. Jones, founder of PRRI Public Religion Research Institute, published most notably in his book White Too Long, which repeatedly shows that white Christians, even mainline Protestants, consistently hold more racist views than religiously unaffiliated white people. And I don't know about y'all, but for those of you who were there in Charlotte, however long it was ago, a month or 2 ago, at the annual gathering, maybe you recognized something that I heard at least a couple of times. As a relative newcomer to attending Alliance annual gatherings, I was surprised to hear multiple speakers saying that people of color know to beware white liberals, a sentiment named over half century ago by Malcolm X. Malcolm said, "The white liberal differs from the white conservative only in one way. the liberal is more deceitful than the conservative. The liberal is more hypocritical than the conservative. He goes on to say that white liberals are dangerous because we say the right words, but ultimately we are reluctant to sacrifice any power whiteness has afforded us, and therefore we do not follow through with anti-racist action. Those are hard things for us to hear, but I think it helps us to know that, that perhaps we do have a problem. So the question that I want us to ask today is, why do we have this problem? What are the things that causes us, even as people who, I guess as they'd say where I'm from, that people who know better, to do things that maybe we really wish we were not doing. So when I was at the Alliance meeting, I really wanted to protest those assertions that were being made. I wanted to say to them, hey, y'all, you're calling out the wrong audience. Don't you know that those of us who have come to Charlotte to be here are among the most committed to preaching and enacting the justice-centered gospel of Jesus? Yet I had to remember that even for myself, as the old preacher said, there are parts of me that have not yet heard the gospel. There is always more work to do. And part of why there is always more work to do, even for those of us who deeply care about anti-racism, the full impact of the toxic groundwater we ingested, that can still lie under our awareness. So 2 years ago, my mom and I were driving in the car from North Carolina, where she lives and where I grew up, if you can't tell from my very mild accent. But we were driving from North Carolina to Kentucky for my graduation from the aforementioned Doctor of Ministry degree program that I had recently finished, a degree that was predominated by research and writing about anti-racism. And after we got in the car, we had only gotten a minute or so away from home when we passed my home church. And that reminded my mom to tell me about a petty crime that had recently occurred to the church bus parked there in the church parking lot right beside the church building. How many times can I say church in one sentence? So, how do you think that I envisioned the person who broke into the church bus? Remember, I'm on my way to get this degree because I'm done good work about anti-racism, but on the way to graduation, I'm not even a mile from my mama's home. When she told me that story, I pictured in my mind a black man. I didn't even think about it. It was completely unconscious that when she was describing this, I was picturing it in my head, and the person that had done this was a black man. And would you believe that it took me over an hour of riding in the car toward Kentucky to come to the horrific realization of what I had done? I realized with horror the racist image that I had constructed unconsciously. On my way to this celebration of my anti-racist work, I was reminded that racist ideology is still active within me. And as much as I'm ashamed of that fact, I am thankful that I was able to recognize my unconscious bias and consciously decide to think and act contrary to that embedded bias. And I would imagine I'm not the only one who struggles with things like that too. Another way that we are in this situation that we are in, that we as white Christians as a whole are struggling with racism, is because something that the philosopher Charles Mills calls an epistemology of ignorance. Researchers have discovered that the lack of awareness of racism among white people is not solely due to our socialization and subsequent implicit bias. We have also chosen a way of living in the world that obscures the blatant realities of racism right in front of us. Charles Mills says that white people use an epistemology of ignorance to, quote, misinterpret the world that they themselves have made. In this epistemology of ignorance, according to the sociologist Jennifer Mueller, we are, quote, engaging in a process of knowing designed to resist racial understanding, empathy, and moral responsibility. And for those of you who don't use the word epistemology every day, epistemology is the study of how we come to knowledge, how we know what we know. So the term epistemology of ignorance is seemingly contradictory, a way of knowing in which we know nothing. But in regards to racism, as noted by Emerson and Bracy, quote, not knowing is a powerful form of preserving the status quo. Sadly, it gets worse. Not only do we metaphorically bury our heads in the sand to miss what is obvious, but according to Mueller, we are adept at finding ways to further obscure the truth. And she wrote an article several years ago about a study that she did based on a paper that she asked students in a couple of different classes that she taught to write. And these classes were both classes where that were about that were focused on exploring the social reproduction of racial inequality and the racial wealth gap. They had spent a whole semester talking about the ways that racism is a problem in within us, in our culture, in our society, and in our systems. And she asked them at the end of the semester to write a paper exploring their own family's intergenerational wealth transmission, and to produce a written analysis relating data that they had collected from their family to the course material. But she found something really interesting, that even of these students who had been in a class on anti-racism all semester, that when it came to writing about their families, they still didn't want to believe that racism was something that impacted them and had helped their family to collect the wealth that they have. And there are four ways that happened. And here they are. First of all, she said that some students used evasion, which she says are maneuvers that preclude producing race-based understandings. And she talks about a student who she calls Josh, who said that in his paper that he chose not to ask his family members, quote, if they thought race had played a role in their success, despite, as Mueller said, it being an explicit guideline in the paper of that is what he was supposed to ask. He attributed, she said, evasion to his, quote, very non-confrontational nature. Another student, she said, accurately attributed her family wealth in part to government programs that were not available to anyone other than white people, but still somehow failed to mention race at all in her paper. The second way that she found that that we try to remain ignorant and not take responsibility for the ways that racism has benefited us is what she calls willful colorblindness. She says that those are maneuvers that introduce alternate factors to neutralize evidence of white privilege and facilitate ongoing use of colorblind frames, such as when students shared data implying white privilege, usually things covered in the course material, but then introduced alternate factors. I also almost said alternative facts. Maybe that's true too. But they introduced alternate factors to facilitate misanalyzing, ignoring, and or rejecting the racial dynamics of those examples. They tried to sort of shift the responsibility and say, oh, it's these other things that I can use to explain. Somewhat similarly, she talks about something that she calls tautological ignorance, which she says are maneuvers that produce racially conscious logic, but embed morally laden assumptions of whites' sincere, passive ignorance. One student said, "For me to consider my family racially prejudiced, I must accept racism as an unconscious act because these are not people who would willingly cause harm to others." This student, who she called Chelsea, called on ignorance to resolve this dissonance between recognizing that her family had benefited from and helped reduce patterns of oppression, as Mueller says, despite being morally opposed to racism in principle. But in this, as Mueller said, Chelsea holds an a priori assumption about the morality of her family. She holds from the very beginning as something that is unarguable, that her family is morally upright and wouldn't do bad things, and uses that as her basis to say that surely her family must have been passively and sincerely ignorant. Finally, the category that she calls mystified solutions, which she describes as maneuvers that produce racially conscious logic, but embed doubt and mystery about logically related solutions. She says, in mystifying practical solutions, students built another ideological defense. Whites do not manage to learn about systemic racism simply because they don't know how to make things better. They tried to say, oh, this problem is too big and we don't know how to solve it, as a way of absolving themselves of any responsibility of actually trying to do something about it. These students, as I said, were in these classes that Mueller taught. They heard this information all semester, but they continued to say in this paper for their college class, this racism stuff doesn't apply to me and my family. And I wonder how many of us, in ways large and maybe small, have a similar mindset, as well as do other people in our churches. Finally, I think the reason that we're in the predicament that we are is because of a reluctance to sacrifice for equity. I've just recently become familiar with some of the work of a sociologist named Musa Al-Gharib, and he talks about his experience living in Manhattan in the last few years as a graduate student at Columbia. He talks about being surrounded by thousands and thousands of people who claim to be progressive, who verbally support anti racism, but act in a way that is contrary to their supposed deeply held beliefs. For instance, he says, these wealthy Manhattanites say that they believe in racism, but when it comes to their children, they prioritize paying tens of thousands of dollars in tuition to send their kids to private schools or work tirelessly to get their kids into elite public schools, all of which, all of the schools, all of them claim to be committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yet, the impact is that the public schools for which these students were zoned for attending are underfunded and largely forgotten. This means that power and influence continue to be centered in elite schools in New York City, while the regular public schools languish with limited resources and low parental or community support. But he argues if these people allowed their children to go to the public school they're supposed to go to, that they were zoned to attend, the resources of these parents' time, money, and influence currently directed at these elite schools could now be focused on these neighborhood public schools, which could be transformative. But in this case, and in many other instances too, when we have the opportunity to either hoard our resources or give them away, we are reluctant to act in a way that is consistent with our stated commitments. What was that Jesus said about taking up our cross and following him? It's hard to do. So what are we to do given all of these things? How shall we respond? First of all, I think that we need to keep cultivating awareness. Just like I was talking about earlier with my embarrassing realization when I was on the way to graduation, we can keep being more aware of the ways that we have subtle biases in our lives. We know that, unfortunately, there is no way to completely eradicate the racism that dwells in us after a lifelong socialization. But as we continue to cultivate our awareness, we can identify more quickly our biases, such as the aforementioned Black people are criminals, and thus have the power to act based on our justice-centered beliefs rather than our unconscious, often racist biases. We must also call on our fellow Christians to introspection so that we, as people committed to anti-racism, can avoid as much as possible unintentionally harmful words and actions. But also, our quest for awareness should extend into something of an interrogation of our church structures, searching for the ways that the culture of white superiority has infected the ways that we organize ourselves and make decisions, such that the systems of a supposed anti-racist church do not unintentionally create racist outcomes. And I think, unfortunately, too many of our Christian organizations are governed by white supremacist ways of being and ways of operating than anti-racist ways of living and operating in the world. Also, this is a hard thing for me to say, but I have been so struck in the last few days by reading the words of Musa Al-Gharib that I mentioned a few minutes ago, who recently graduated with his PhD from Columbia, in that we are called to do small things, and that sometimes small things can have an outsized impact. He calls for what he calls an ascetic anti-racism. And here's what he suggests as possible ways to be an ascetic anti-racist. Avoid moral grandstanding on race. Abstain from itemizing charitable donations in attempt to lower one's tax liability, because because poorer people or lower middle income people are more likely to pay more percentage wise in income taxes than wealthier people are, and those tax dollars can be used to support those people who are in poverty and who have been historically oppressed and disadvantaged. He continues, refrain from summoning the authorities against people of color in response to petty crimes. Adopt a yes in my backyard posture. You ever heard of that? YMBY. Instead of being a NIMBY, not in my backyard, adopt a yes in my backyard posture with regard to community development. He goes on, whenever possible, rely on carpooling, public transportation, or taxis to get around instead of rideshare apps, because taxis or public transportation provide living wages to the people who work there, as opposed to the way in so much of the gig economy that rideshare apps don't provide any stability to the people who work, who are contract workers for them, not employees of the rideshare companies. Similarly, he says to avoid delivery services as much as you can. And when you do feel like you need to use delivery services or go out to eat, or you get a package from UPS or FedEx, to be extraordinarily generous when you have the opportunity to tip the person that is doing this service for you, as a way, especially for delivery services and for underpaid wait staff, to help them get closer to a livable wage than is possible through the work that they are doing. He offers a few more possibilities of simple things that we can do. Treat all service workers with dignity equivalent to one's peers. I mean, do we have to say that to ourselves as Christians? Aren't we supposed to believe that everyone bears the image of God and that everyone is a beloved child of God? Why would we even need to be reminded that we need to treat each other, no matter who it is, with dignity? And finally, he says, if you're in a position of authority, make extra effort to recruit, mentor, promote, or admit qualified people of color to work and work to ensure that all subordinate employees receive compensation that is both genuinely livable and representative of the value they bring to the organization. So these things that he talks about are things that can seem small and simple to do. But just in reading this in the last few days, it has been extremely helpful to me, because I don't know about you, but there are so many times when I feel paralyzed, because it feels like the world's problems are so big and complex, and I, in comparison, am so small and insignificant to be able to even to begin to repair those things. But Al-Gharib reminds us that even these things that may be simple can begin to cause um, bigger impacts, especially when we share these things with others, when others see us and commit themselves to doing these things. So, whenever we feel paralyzed, I hope we will realize that there are things that you and I are already doing, small actions that may have an outsized impact. And as hard as it is to say, and as I say somewhat reticently, because in regards to racism, when self-flagellation often feels appropriate and humility requisite, I think that there are times when it is appropriate for us to celebrate the small actions that we are taking to combat our racialized society and to prove that everyone, particularly people who have been historically and are presently oppressed, the people that Jesus called the least of these, who are members of God's family, are all beloved children of God. So continue doing the small things that may have a big impact. And as leaders in your churches, encourage your congregations to do that too. Third, as excited as I am by discovering Al Garab's helpful framing of simple, though perhaps costly ways of being anti-racist, I think that there is always a place, especially for us as people of faith, to believe that seismic change is possible, to have hope that God's new day will come, doing things like paying reparations, participating in civil disobedience, running for office, writing a book, hiring ministers of colors, rejecting anytime, anywhere, any comments or actions that do anything to deny the full humanity of any person. Listen to Black voices. Listen to Indigenous voices. Sacrifice power and resources. Work for universal human thriving, abundant life for all. Bring a new church into being. And finally, I think that ultimately, what is most important is for us to be grounded in our identity, to remember who we are, to remember who you are as an individual, and to call on our churches to remember who they are. I think it's pretty certain that you all would not be here today, and your church likely would not affiliate itself with the Alliance if you did not deeply believe that anti-racism lies at the heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That same Jesus who reminded us that faithfulness is defined by our love for God and our love in action for everyone. As we heard at the annual gathering, tragically, our white Christian forebears proved that we, even progressive white Christians, are not trustworthy partners for our siblings who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. So we have to prove by truly being who we are that we are worthy co-laborers in the work of creating a world where everyone can thrive, where everyone can experience the abundance of life that Jesus promised. Some of this work may be simple and easy, and some of the work will be complex and hard, but all of the work is worth it. All of the work is sacred. May we journey together until at last we see the dawning of God's new day. And as a recovering preacher, I have to conclude by saying amen.